online, I'm limiting the questions asked here to just those about NDC reservation. I'm trying to answer some of the other ones as we go along online. So, and another note, somebody asked if we will be publishing all the online questions, and the answer to that is no. We will try to get to them. We will get a printout of all them or a report of all the questions asked online, and we will try to get to as many as we can. There are literally hundreds, which is great. That's what this is for. But the questions I'm asking here are specifically about reservation. Thank you. How may NDC reservation be applied to biologics, which is reviewed by CBER?
Yes, both CDER and CVM have their own process for NDC reservation. Unfortunately, we cannot answer questions for other centers. So as far as the requirements for those centers, you can contact them directly. But yes, they do.
Is the reservation process to be used, or can it be used for drug substances and APIs, or is it just for finished products?
It can be used for any drugs as far as you provide those informations that are required to reserve an NDC, then you can. Our prediction is, as you can imagine, that this is not necessarily used by all firms. It's something mostly unique to contract manufacturers or any sponsors that need to list their product. They need to actually reserve an NDC prior to printing their labels, or any kind of drugs that are in development, whether a prescription or OTC. So we're anticipating that those are the users that will benefit from this feature the most, but it's not necessarily limited to those.
This is less about reservation, but it's about that sort of time period in the process pre-approval. It says, will an NDC number change after a product goes from pre-approval to post-approval? So does the NDC number change upon approval? Want to take that, Layla?
So that's exactly one of the reasons we started this process with the new regulations, because one of the problems that we encountered over the years was that a lot of firms, when they had an application with FDA, were under impression that NDC is part of the approval process. So they would provide their labeling for approval, and the NDC was actually included on the labeling. And once it got approved, they were under impression that FDA has approved their NDCs. That is not the case. You submit your drug listing. Once your drug is approved, as you all know, you get the approval letter, which in it says you have 14 days to submit labeling information to FDA and through structured product labeling format. And nowadays, everyone uses drug listing, SPL, to submit that information. Once they did that, they realized, oh, that NDC is actually not available for listing. And the argument was that, oh, but our labeling got approved, and the NDC was included on it. The review divisions are all very, very knowledgeable, but their task is not to look at the NDC and approve the NDC. Your NDC is proposed through your drug listing file, and it gets accepted by FDA as the NDC proposed for that particular listed product. So we enabled firms to go ahead and send that reservation before you put that on the label, so you know that NDC is available, you can put it on the label, you can start printing, and that NDC will not change from before approval to after approval. So that was the whole idea.
And the boss, Jeff, told me to come forward when I'm going to answer a question here. I'm going to field one. There was a question about can you reserve an NDC if you're going to use it for the DEA's ARCOS system? And the answer is yes, if you also need to or are required to list that NDC with the FDA. If you are just obtaining a labeler code and an NDC for the purposes of filing with DEA, but you are not required to list with us. For instance, you are manufacturing the product just for clinical trials or for research. You're not required. You are exempt from registration and listing on our end, but the ARCO system does require an NDC, a valid NDC from us. So no, you are not required to reserve an NDC through this process or even list it, but you can still obtain an NDC, or at least obtain a labeler code from us and assign it an NDC for the purposes of filing with the DEA. Do you want to add to that?
I just also wanted to just remind everyone again that no one is required to reserve an NDC. That's just a tool available to industry to hopefully make their lives easier.
Anyone, I presume Troy or David, what happens to the NDC at the end of 2 years if it is not listed? Or anyone?
Well, then at that point, the agency will going to remove that NDC. It's going to be placed, I've assumed, in an inactive status. Keep in mind, this is for products, obviously, that you want to reserve during that time frame of 2 years. And so that's why we put out, as Troy did it, he put out the date out to 2 years. We're going to limit it at that, to that time frame.
And as David also talked about it in length earlier, if you list an NDC with a future marketing end date, even if it doesn't enter the market, that NDC is out of inventory. It cannot be reused for any other products unless it's listed for that or used for that exact same product coming back in the market. If you reserve an NDC and it gets canceled, it goes back to the inventory of available NDCs. So that's a very distinct difference between the two functions.
I'm going to skip forward to a question since we're on that subject there. When assigning NDC numbers, where are the reserved NDCs listed is a question. How do I know I'm not using a reserved NDC?
From a standpoint of the reservation, once you've submitted the file, if a number has already been used, you will receive an error message in your submission. Another way that folks can check for listed NDCs, obviously, is to go to the NDC directory. The directory will house all of the products that are obviously in commercial distribution and that have passed validation. Another option is to actually contact the e-Duro staff, and then we can provide that information under a specific labeler code for firms. But we would strongly encourage you to reference the National Drug Code. I'm sorry, National NDC Directory.
I will also add to what David just said. The reserved ones will not be published anywhere. So the easiest way to do it is just to make a very quick submission, NDC reservation submission. If you get a rejection about this NDC is already reserved or it's not available for the reservation, it means that it's not available to you to use.
Troy, I believe you covered this, but just it'd be worth repeating. Is an NDC that is reserved then permanently linked to the set ID used in the reservation file so that any future listing, any update to an actual listing for that NDC must use the same set ID?
That is correct. So the set ID have to link to the NDC, whether it's active or in reserve or listing.
Can affirm that has never filed an ANDA before and does not have a labeler code itself reserve an NDC, and if so, how do they do that?
I think they can still request for the label code, right? And they can.
Right.
I mean, like I said, the reserve process doesn't require much data, so I don't think it's going to be error out where they
The process for those folks would be to request the labeler code
Correct.
first and get that properly and actively assigned, and then you may reserve any NDC under that. And we
You have to
haven't-
have a labeler code, and it has to be actually included in the electronic system. So you can either reserve or list any products electronically.
Microphone number one, nice and close, go ahead.
Just to go back to that, the question about the set ID. So if you cancel a reservation and then you decide to use it for something else, would you submit a new, you'd submit a new listing, right? You wouldn't need that same set ID to the canceled reservation.
Correct.
Okay.
If a number has been reserved and the company by accident tries to use that number for another product, will this fail validation?
Yes. Short answer, yes.
I'm sorry, that's not a reservation. Does the reservation, we had this, does the reservation also apply to bulk ingredients, APIs?
Yes.
Yes.
And do you need to certify NDC reservations and to maintain their active status?
No.
Is the marketing status of new only for NDC reservations, or is it ever used for a valid drug listing?
Only for NDC reservation.
So I also want to emphasize that because we have seen examples of people looking at the drop-down menu. Unfortunately, we're limited to the available terminology that are already defined. So it's not perfect. Hopefully we'll change it to reserved completely, at least at the CDER direct end. So it's easier for folks to realize that this is actually not a new listing. So we have seen firms that submit drug listing information with a complete set of data that is required for drug listing, thinking that their product is actually listed under the marketing status new, because in their opinion, they're actually listing a new product. That term new or reserved is only for reservation. Your product is not listed if it is actually under marketing status new or reserved.
Now we're really getting into the technical weeds here. What if a reservations, two different reservations are made for two different strengths of the same drug on different set IDs? Can you combine them for a future full single SPL listing in the future when you list them for real?
From my understanding, they have to, set ID have to stay with the NDC. So.
Correct. Yeah, and I would say, so think ahead, save yourself some work if you're doing that, and put the two strengths on the same SPL listing.
I'm sorry, I keep thinking of new things we need to remind the industry just because this is a new concept this year. Just keep in mind your NDC reservation SPL can change into a drug listing SPL. So if you can list products on the same SPL, then you can reserve them on the same SPL. So the idea is that those products that share the same reservation or listing SPL should actually share the same package insert. Because for each SPL, you're allowed to submit one package insert, right? Or prescribing information. If that is different from one drug to another, they cannot be reserved on the same SPL. If you do that, then you're going to have to then cancel and send two different SPLs for those two different drugs. If you're sending, as the question asked, two different strengths of the same active ingredient, because they share, and if they share the same prescribing information, it's ideal that they're on the same reservation SPL so you can convert it into a drug listing SPL and you do not have to send two different SPLs with the same prescribing information. So hopefully that makes sense.
And a number of questions about this, so I'll just summarize here. Can someone go over or summarize, list the data elements that can change from reservation to full listing without having to change the NDC? And what, I'll ask the other part two in a minute, but what What data elements are allowed to change when you go from a reservation to an NDC without having to change the NDC?
So I think the only option that can change, I think, is marketing category. I think everything else, you're going to have to require manual override. Like I think 90% in data element. That's why it's very important that when you submit a NDC reservation, only fill in the requirement data. Don't try to fill in the option, because chances are you will come back and change something, and that's when you run into some issue, and it's going to delay your process. It's going to require some manual override.
And what if you reserved multiple NDCs on a single file, say multiple strengths, but you only need to list one or two of them? What do you do with the others? How do you get rid of them?
Again, you could have the option to cancel it, or you wait until 2 years and it'll expire by itself.
For it, these are more general listing questions. I believe that is it. I think we're close to our time limit anyway. Jeff?
Well,
Oh,
and
no,
got-
we have a
we've
question
got
here.
One
I'm
more
sorry.
coming up in the room.
Please.
Please go ahead.
Yes, if you reserved an NDC, different strengths, so you have two different set IDs, could you merge them using the related document coding at the time of listing?
We have to check on that, because I think it can run into some complications. So shoot out an email. We'll follow up with you all.
My guess is that no, but I'm not the technical expert in the room.
Okay. And that is all the time we have for questions. Please help me thank our panel for coming and answering those.